Well, good morning, NorthPoint Church. My name is Jay Quick, and I'm on staff here at the church. And we get to continue in our Rage and Restoration series today, which I'm thankful for because it's been such a good series for myself and learning so much about forgiveness. And you've heard Jeremy talk about a number of stories that have been encouraging to our staff and our church as these stories have kind of surfaced about forgiveness. I want to share with you one of those stories today. It was between a husband and a wife, and through this forgiveness series, they kind of had some things surface where they said, you know what, I think we need to work on this forgiveness thing a little bit. And the wife ended up confessing to her husband and said, you know what, for quite a few years now, I recognized I've just been kind of on your case. I kept nagging you, I kept kind of going at you, I kept being angry at you, and I just want to express I'm sorry. Like, I'm really sorry for what's taking place, but I also want to kind of commend you for how you've handled yourself. As I think back of somebody had been doing that to me for a number of years, I'd be pretty angry and I might have lashed out. And the husband kind of looked at her and then ended up walking over to the bathroom, and she's like, what in the world's going on? And he comes back from the bathroom. She's like, where'd you go? What is going on? And he said, well, I had to go clean your toothbrush because every time you would get angry at me, I'd use your toothbrush to clean our toilet. So I'll let you decide if that story is true or not. But we get to talk about anger today. And anger is kind of an awkward topic here in the Midwest. Sometimes we do that passive-aggressively, maybe with a toothbrush or in other ways with our words or what maybe may be. Or sometimes we lash out and become hot-tempered. And so we get to dive into anger today, the rage part of Rage and Restoration. So if you have your Bibles, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27 is where we're going to start today. And this is Paul writing to the church of Ephesus. He's writing in this area of the letter about Christian living and how to live as a follower of Jesus. And as they live as followers of Jesus, anger is central to that, and how we respond to anger and how we're dealing with anger. And so if you have your chair Bibles, page 949. If you have other Bibles, Ephesians 4, 26 and 27. We'll go ahead and dive in. Verse 26 says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. And one of the most important things for us when we are dealing with anger centuries ago and now is this understanding of how we approach anger, our approach to anger. And one of the ways that we read this kind of strange command from Paul is he talks about this idea, in your anger, do not sin. Here he's clarifying it's not a sin to be angry. And maybe some of you are in a religious upbringing or something where like never express anger. It's an emotion. We just stuff it. We don't talk about it. Never be angry. It's a sin to be angry. That's not really true. We see that here in Paul's words. We see that elsewhere in Scripture. Proverbs 19:11 talks about good sense or wisdom makes one slow to anger, and it's his glory to overlook an offense. And so if we go through the wisdom areas of the Bible, like Proverbs, you'll see that to be a wise man, you understand anger is to be slow to anger. It's to take a while to get to anger, which makes sense when we look at kind of the Hebrew understanding and usage of the word anger. In the Old Testament, God describes himself as gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And so God himself, in his very nature, is slow to anger. It's not wrong to be angry. It's how we approach anger that sometimes makes it a sin. And what's interesting, if you break down the Hebrew translation and you translate it literally into English, the passage would read something like this. The Lord your God is gracious and compassionate and long of nose. And you're like, what? What does a long nose have anything to do with anger? And I've never thought of God as a long nose. Like, what a weird thing about that. It's not really physically God with a long nose, but it's kind of a metaphor for understanding how Hebrew culture would understand the word anger. If you think to Genesis 39, you read the account of Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of trying to sleep with her, and she gets really angry, and it leads to this blow-up situation, and she tells Potiphar, and we read in Genesis 39, that Potiphar's anger was kindled, or he became angry as he was made aware of what was taking place between Joseph, or what allegedly was taking place between Joseph and his wife. And in that translation, it's actually saying Potiphar's nose grew hot. And their understanding of this was when you become angry, your face gets all red and you feel very hot and warm. So in the Hebrew understanding, someone with a long nose was a patient person because it took a while for the heat or the anger to reach their face. Someone with a short nose was somebody who was hot-tempered or impatient. The understanding there helps us kind of process that. We see that Jesus himself, even in the New Testament, was angry. He was flipping over tables. We have an AI image of that, actually. You'll see Jesus being angry right here. He's super angry as he flips over the tables. Actually, I think I got that one wrong. I wasn't quite flipping over tables like that, but Jesus was angry in the temple. He was flipping over tables, not quite the back flip, but flipping them over because of what was taking place. Jesus himself was angry. James 1, we talk about slowness to anger. James 1:19 talks about this idea and relates slowness of anger to being quick to listen and slow to speak. It's a slowness to speak and being quick to listen in relationship to anger. I had an opportunity a couple weeks ago with a counselor friend of mine named Matt, and we had the chance to sit down, and I called him up and said, Matt, I'm preaching on anger in a couple weeks, and I don't really have any idea even what it is. Like, I kind of have a biblical idea for what it is, but I'm not sure why I get angry. I'm not sure how to really process anger. I've understood that anger is like a secondary emotion. Can you help me process anger a little bit? He said, absolutely. And it was a super great time with my friend who's a counselor, and we sat down and talked about anger, and he said, it's super helpful to think of anger as an emotional indicator. Anger is an emotional indicator for something maybe on the outside that we're experiencing anger that's happening inwardly that we're processing. Anger is indicating something that's taking place inside of us. You also think about anger as like a check engine light. When your check engine light comes on in your car, you're like, well, I better pop the hood. I better check out what's going on with my engine. I need to self-examine what's taking place underneath the hood. The anger is the same way. When anger is expressed in our lives, we have to ourselves kind of pop the hood and take a look at saying, what's going on inside my heart? Which leads us to kind of our second thought as we deal with anger is to analyze anger. This is a super important part. When we become angry, we have to approach it in the right way, but we have to analyze our anger because it's telling us something that's taking place inwardly. Augustine used to talk about this idea of disordered loves lead to disordered anger. You ever met somebody who's been disproportionately angry at something, you're like, why did they just freak out? That was kind of a small thing. Typically, a disordered love or a high value of theirs may have been crossed or threatened, and it leads them to be disproportionately angry. This happened to me the other day as I was getting some wonderful first-class food driving through Bebop's, and it's just the best. Like, I love it. If they had a loyalty program, I would be like VIP, and I would be platinum member, but I live right by it. It's just a great burger. And I probably might eat it for lunch now that I'm getting hungry. But I love Bebop's, and so we're going through Bebop's line. If you're familiar with the original Bebop's, you don't really sit inside at these older ones. You just either walk up to the window, you drive through the passenger side line, or you drive through the driver's side line. And this individual experience of mine, I was going through the driver's side window because they didn't have a passenger side open. It was just closed for short staff or whatever the reason. I'm like, I got to get my burger. I'm stinking hungry. I'm getting a little bit of hangry going on, waiting for my burger. And it took forever to work my way through this Bebop's line. And there I find myself thinking like, if I managed this Bebop's, I'd make way more money than this guy or whatever he's doing. And these lazy workers, if they just could fill up the soda quicker and get through the line or whatever's going on, I'm just like being angry about getting my Bebop's burger. And so fast forward to this week, I was studying anger quite a bit more, and I went through Culver's for a late-night ice cream treat, because why not? It sounds amazing. And so I go through the Culver's line, and I'm getting some vanilla ice cream concrete mixer with some Reese's peanut butter cup mixed in there, and I was so excited to get this. I was one car out of the line to order. I was like the one car out, so it was like I got one car to wait, then I get my order, and this is going to go super quick. It took me 30 minutes to get ice cream. 30 minutes to get stinking ice cream. But what was interesting about that experience is I pulled through, it was nighttime, and I got my ice cream. I'm like, wait a second, this looks dark. It was chocolate ice cream, not vanilla. And they gave me Snickers instead of Reese's peanut butter cups. I'm like, what in the world? How do you screw up both of these things? So I walked inside and kind of put on a smile late at night, and I was just like, hey, this got screwed up, And so did that interaction, got a new one, and was able to go back home. But I was processing this. As I analyzed my anger, I was way more angry at the Bebop situation than I was at the Culver situation. Why? Well, my kids were already down in bed. I didn't have anywhere to be, and there was really not much left to do except enjoy my ice cream at the end of the night. Whereas when I was going through Bebop's, as I analyzed my anger, I wasn't really angry at the workers. I was angry at myself for not planning enough time to get through the Bebop's line because I had a meeting that I had to get to, and what I recognized is my values were threatened. Anger was indicating to me that I had some values that were being threatened. I value being on time. I'm late way more often than I desire to be, but I kind of get antsy when I'm going to be late. I'm like, I like being on time. I value what other people think of me quite a bit. And I was like, man, I don't want to show up to this meeting and then have these people think that I'm lazy or like inconsiderate or, I'm getting angry and angry as I wait longer and longer. I value being successful, and I want other people to see me as successful. So as I show up to a meeting late, I'm like, they're going to think that I'm not very successful and I don't take my job seriously, or whatever the case. I wasn't angry at the bebops workers. As I analyzed my anger, I was angry because my value systems were being threatened. We see that overlooking an offense is wise. It was so much easier to overlook Culver's offense because it cost me nothing. I was going to go home, I was going to go to sleep. There was nothing that time wasted cost me. But costing me showing up late to a meeting, to me, was a lot, and it threatened those values. Just as you can trace smoke back to a fire, oftentimes you can trace your anger back to a value of yours that's being threatened. And it might not be showing up on time, but it might be something else. There's a book that Joe in our office talks about quite a bit. I can't quite endorse it because I haven't read all of it. So if you're short-nosed about reading it and don't like it, blame Joe. But Seven Primal Questions is the book that Joe will talk about. He's a worship lead and creative lead. You'll see him talk about this book, and 7 Primal Questions by Mike Foster. And these questions are values that we hold. He argues that all of us hold one of these 7 values, and it drives us to make decisions. It's our worldview of which we operate. And then one of the taglines of the book is, the primal question is a simple way of seeing your hidden programming and emotional needs. So here's the 7 questions that he suggests we all have a primary question of these that drive our life choices. Am I safe? Am I secure? Am I loved? Am I wanted? Am I successful? Am I good enough? Do I have purpose? He argues that all of these are ways in which we operate and we have decisions to be made around, but just play this out for a second. Say recently you may have lost a job, and lost a job not in the sense of like, I hate my job and they let me go and I got a sweet severance package. No, like you feel like kind of unjustly you lost your job, which would be a natural emotion of being hurt. But to the degree of being super, super angry and just gossiping about, my boss did this, and can you believe that guy? And I hated this work environment, and going on and on and on and on. Oftentimes, what you may have found surface is somebody who is really wounded by that, as their primal question might be, am I wanted? And if your primal question is, am I wanted, and you were just let go from your job, you're going to have some serious tension there, likely producing anger in your life. Anger is this emotional indicator, and oftentimes it's a disordered love that leads to disordered angers. Might not be, am I wanted or am I successful for you, but maybe it's your reputation on the line. Maybe you have a desire for safety or control, and when you feel your safety or control has been threatened, you get really angry. And the reality of all of these questions is we seek to answer them, but Jesus has already answered them for us, hasn't he? When we go through, am I safe? Absolutely. Like Jesus has offered us eternal security in his promise in his life. And am I loved? Jesus died for us on the cross. And am I wanted? Jesus gave up his life for us. You can go through all these questions. You see, the problem is when we have one of those values and put it as the ultimate thing rather than an ultimate relationship with Jesus as our ultimate thing, disordered loves create disordered anger, and we find ourselves getting mad in the bebops line or whatever it may be. And so I think our third thing that we do after we kind of analyze, we do some of this soul work. I know bebops and those things might be a silly analogy, but I think there's some truth behind. We have to analyze our anger. We don't just stop at analyzing it, though. We also have to address our anger. And addressing our anger leads to us a few different ways how we address this. Ephesians 4:15 and 25 talk about being honest and speaking truthfully. If you read those, that's a key passage in understanding to Christian values and living. We have to be honest, and I think one of the ways about our anger is we just have to admit it. We just have to come forth and say, hey, I am angry. Whether somebody has caused me to be angry or I'm just angry from something that I'm processing in my life, we just have to be able to admit our anger. I was in our 423 group, which is a great group that we have at our church that offers healing for those struggling with sexual addiction. And as we were there one night, one individual just said, every time I confess the temptation, the week ahead of me, I just don't wrestle as much with that temptation. There's some kind of power about taking our sin from the darkness and bringing it into the light. And I think the same thing is true about our anger. When we have an awareness of it, when I have the ability just to confess and admit our anger, there's so much power that's being taken away from that. There was a youth trip, one of my first youth trips I led in 2014. Back in a challenge trip, it was down in Kansas City. We're at this event, and I got a call well after midnight, and I'm woken up, and I'm like, oh goodness, what is this going to lead to? Teenagers after midnight, all good things happen then, right? And so I get this call from one of our students, and she's like, you need to come to our room and just check something out. So I'm like, oh goodness gracious, what in the world is a room of 4 girls going to do now? So I walk up there, I walk into the bedroom, and there's 2 queen beds, and one has totally collapsed, totally just busted. And I'm going, how did that take place? Well, no, just tell me the truth. Well, we were jumping across from bed to bed and it just collapsed. And you're like, well, that would do the trick, And I was like, well, we got to go down. We got to talk to the hotel lobby, just make them aware of the issue and what's taking place. And so we talked to them. And on the way down, they're going, Jay, we were so worried. You're going to be so angry with us. And I was like, why? It's just a busted bed. It's not that big a deal. What? It's no problem. They said, well, what would it take to make you really angry, Jay? What would take place for you to be really upset at us? You've been our youth pastor for a year now. We've never even seen you mad yet. I was like, I don't know. And then fast forward a few years and some sleepless nights and toddlers will do that to me quite easily, right? Anybody who's parents it, it's like, oh my goodness. And the reality of that, though, is this. We have to admit that anger is always in us. We may not have the circumstances for that anger to surface. I used to think, well, I just don't struggle like those people with anger or blow up hot-tempered anger stuff. But the reality of it is none of my values at that point in life had been seriously threatened. I didn't have that opportunity, so I didn't have to analyze my anger, deal with it. There's nothing that had really significantly gone wrong or horrible in my life where it just made me super angry. But the reality of it is, a few kids can do that sometimes. But the reality of just admitting our anger. The other part of admitting your anger is this takes a lot of courage, and it takes a ton of humility and vulnerability. But when you can admit your anger to somebody that's offended you, there's power in that relationship. And what I mean by that is you come at a humble, courageous place to admit and say, hey, when this took place, when you said this thing, when you did that thing to me, I just got to confess to you, man, it made me really angry. I'm upset. I'm still holding on to that. I just got to have a conversation with you about it. And what you do in that moment, when you admit your anger to your offender, not all the time, but often, what you do is you level the playing field for that person to say, you know what? They've been vulnerable to me and expressed weakness. Therefore, I can express my weakness back and say, you know what? I screwed up. When we admit our anger to those that have offended us, and not just petty stuff, but more deeper stuff, it levels the playing field and it brings about a humility and vulnerability in relationships that have a profound ability to heal. The next thing that we see is in verse 26. It says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are angry. And what this is talking about is it's not this specific moment of hey, every night by midnight, you got to take care of every single little angry thing and wake your spouse up and go, you know what, it's midnight, I got to confess I'm angry still. It's not that kind of thing. It's more of a posture of keeping current. We have to keep current with our anger. Why? Otherwise, the devil gets a foothold in our lives. And if we read at verse 31, that foothold looks like and plays itself out in bitterness, anger, rage, brawling, slander, malice. That's what takes place if we fail to keep current with our anger. The devil gets a foothold and it plays itself out. Usually 2 ways that plays itself out. We can kind of break those into 2 categories. We either stuff it until we get to a place of exploding. We stuff it and bitterness grows, rage grows, brawling end up working itself out, or we share it. Another word for that, gossip, slander, malice. If we don't deal with it or keep current with it, we stuff it or we share it. A late pastor, American pastor and author, Frederick Buechner, had this to say in light of anger. And I don't even like reading this quote, but man, there's some truth to it that I think we have to look at. He says, in light of anger, to lick your wounds and to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of a bitter confrontation still to come, to savor the last toothsome morsel, both the pain you are given and the pain you're about to give back. In many ways, it is a feast for a king. The chief drawback is that you are wolfing down at this feast yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. Yikes, man, I've been there before. When I hold on to this anger and maybe passive aggressively or whatever the case of it is, I just stuff it or I end up sharing it. You know how you can tell that somebody has failed to address their anger properly? Typically, you're going to continually hear them gossip about that situation over and over and over again. You remember what that person did to me? Oh, you know so-and-so, yeah. Remember that time they did this? Oh, you already know what they did to me that one. Oh, I can't believe that they would have ever done that. We hear these people share these hurt stories over and over and over, and really what it is they haven't kept current with that anger. I myself have done this and found myself stuffing it and then sharing it with everybody else except the person that offended me. We stuff it and we share it. And just like Jeremy's been talking throughout this series, it's just like carrying a weight. Unforgiveness and anger, we're just hurting ourselves. We're the person at that feast that we end up feasting on, and we're hurting ourselves. Anger actually destroys the body, like physically destroys the body. Proverbs 14:30 tells us that a heart of peace gives life, but envy rots the bones. So this idea, I've never really met a person who's angry and peaceful at the same time. It gives life if we're peaceful, but other areas of sin creep in, they destroy the body. I was able to find a few studies on this, and you can talk to different health professionals. But I found a few things that I found quite interesting. They said anger has been linked to heart attacks for those that are experiencing angry outbursts. One study revealed you're 3 times more likely to experience a stroke within 2 hours of lashing out at somebody else. Anger has been linked to a weakened immune system. Studies have linked anger to a deepened level of anxiety and depression. And the last one that I saw was a stat done by the University of Michigan. They say anger can actually shorten your life. An angry person who just bottles it up and channels it and has no way to address it, it shortens your life. So needless to say, anger isn't doing anyone's health a favor, but we know that it's not just our own health. Anger doesn't just destroy our bodies, it destroys the body. It destroys the body of Christ. Proverbs 15:18 says, a hot-tempered man stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict. I thought, what a better way to share the story that most of us probably remember of the old man Marley. Old man Marley, the shovel slayer from South Bend. Home Alone 1, the guy carrying around the shovel. You guys remember Home Alone 1 guy? Kevin's afraid of this guy. I love Home Alone. It's about time to watch it this year again, Christmas time. But Buzz, his older brother, and Kevin are in the room with one of their cousins. He's like, hey, look out, it's Old Man Marley, the South Bend shovel slayer. And they're looking at him, and they're all afraid of South Bend shovel slayer. But I bring that story up because at the end of the movie, if you remember, Kevin's sitting right before he has Harry and Marv over to his house, the fun house, and gets all the bad guys there. He runs into Old Man Marley in the church. Kevin's sitting there, and this choir's going on. He's kind of reflecting, figuring stuff out, and Old Man Marley comes walking down the church, and he sits right next to little Kevin McAllister. He's terrified, right? He's like, oh my gosh, it's the shovel slayer. And what ends up happening there in this interaction is they sit down and they talk to each other. And as they talk, he opens up and he says, that's my granddaughter up there. That's my granddaughter on stage singing. He's like, oh, that's great. So you probably have a great relationship with her. And he's like, actually, no, I never get to see her. That's why I'm here at a distance. I send her Christmas presents from a distance every year, but I don't have a relationship with my son or his family because a number of years ago, we lost our tempers, things got heated, and in that conflict, we said, I don't ever want to see you again. A hot-tempered man stirs up conflict, and by the end of the movie, after Kevin defeats the bad guys, right, we see at the end of the movie, he restores that relationship, and it's a wonderful movie and things. But I bring that up, and I know it's a silly movie, but don't we see that often in our friendships, in our relationships with maybe coworkers, God forbid, but sometimes even within the church, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, and we just fail to address it. And what ends up happening is we don't have a place to graciously work this out, and then we just go our own separate ways, and then we stuff it, and then we share it, and we go, oh, you know what they did to me? You know what they said about me? And then we stuff it, and then we have this angry outburst that results in a loss of relationship. Anger destroys the body, our own and the church body, the body of Christ. The third thing that I think we see in this text in the end of chapter 4 and verse 32 is it just says, be kind. I know we understand this. This is like a simple thing. Like this is like things I'm teaching my kindergartner. Make sure you're kind at preschool today, or whatever there are. It's like, be kind. But I think there's so much truth to this that sometimes we forget about just being kind to each other. For goodness sakes, as followers of Jesus, we can be kind to each other, but especially to those who don't know Jesus. I remember there was a few years ago, I was driving with a friend of mine on 141, just out this way, and as we were driving down 141, there was this guy just tailgating him, and I'm in the passenger seat, and I'm like, I feel like I'm having road rage, and I'm not even driving. Like, this guy back here is crazy, and he's just calm, chilling in the front seat, and there was some construction, and this tailgater behind us, dude, he zips over and zips in front of us, and the guy driving the car that I'm in, he kind of hits the brake and slowly lets him come in. I'm like, dude, I hate to admit it, but I'd be like speeding up, being like, you're not getting in front of me. You've been tailgating me, like, get behind me, guy. And what was so amazing, what I recall that experience with this guy, in a moment where I definitely would have been angry, he just said, oh, he's probably got somewhere to go. I'm like, seriously, that's your response? Like, he's probably got somewhere to go? But it wasn't just in that driving situation. This individual was one who was always kind. And I think when we're kind to others, especially an offender, the opportunity for us to be able to restore those relationships is exponentially higher, just being kind with each other. Before we get to this last point, I just want to bring up one more thing that I was talking to my counselor friend about, and as I was sitting down with him, he just says, hey, coping mechanisms can be helpful for anger, right? We have different coping mechanisms. We maybe have journaling or breathing patterns or exercising or going for a walk or whatever it may be. Like coping mechanisms are good to deal with anger, but they're not going to solve our anger. They're not going to get to the root of our anger. Think about anger like a busted up knee. Somebody just experiences a knee injury and potentially even a tear. Coping mechanisms are like a painkiller. If all you're doing for your anger or your knee injury is just taking a painkiller or a coping mechanism, you're never really going to get to the bottom of that. You really have to probably have surgery to fix a tear, and after surgery, you probably have to do physical therapy to restore your knee to where it's supposed to go. And if we're just having coping mechanisms, which are helpful, we should learn those, practice those, but if we fail to address the issue of our root of our anger, we're never really going to heal. And I think one of the biggest ways that people get stumbled on this issue is this last point, is that we have to see ourselves as forgiven first. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32 says it in this way, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. When we fail to see that we are first sinners, and only secondly have we been sinned against. We first are sinners, secondly have we been sinned against. We fail to get a bigger picture. There's a book by a guy named John Rusihana. It's called The Bishop of Rwanda. My wife was a worker in Rwanda for a number of years. We've had conversations about the Hutu and the Tutsis conflict that stirred up there. If you remember back in the 1990s, a horrible, horrible genocide took place over the entire country. And in his book, he addresses this genocide. And he talks about what he saw and experienced and the loss that he had firsthand. And he was kind of brought up for the country of Rwanda to help bring reconciliation and healing to the country of Rwanda after this genocide. And he talked about it in his book. He said, people who haven't experienced forgiveness themselves from God first will always fail to believe and have the strength to be able to forgive. And I just think that was so powerful. If we don't see ourselves as the ones who have been forgiven first, we're always going to carry this thing, well, they sinned against me, they did this thing. And I think for us to operate under that idea of being forgiven first, we have to gaze upon the cross of Jesus. Where on that cross, Jesus himself said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. As he was hanging on the cross, that's about us. Amidst our sin, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. As we think about the beauty and the glory and the grace and the mercy of Jesus up on that cross and amidst our anger, and some of us in here, I know some of our stories, man, we are carrying some deep deep wounds. And I can't quite relate to those, and I can't quite process those, and I can't quite help you with those. But God can. Jesus can, and Jesus did. And when we find ourselves gazing at the cross, taking our eyes off of our situation, not necessarily overnight, but over time, God gives us the ability to see that we have first been forgiven. And we have the power to forgive and to restore that relationship, just like John Rossi Hanna did in the situation of Rwanda. And as I was thinking about this, I just thought, what a great reminder of the old hymn, the 100-plus-year-old hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. I'm not going to sing it for you, even though I was a part of the Christmas choir. I carry a tune once in a while, but they could tell you probably next to me they don't always carry a tune well, so I'm not going to sing it. But I think some of you guys know it. Turn your eyes to Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Amidst our anger, we look at Jesus' face on the cross, and the line goes, and the things of this earth, including our anger, our anxiety, our bitterness, our rage, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim. Our anger begins to fade. It grows strangely dim in light of his glory and his grace. Not our strength, not our power, but his glory and his grace. We have first been forgiven. Only secondly have we been sinned against. NorthPoint, would you pray with me?